Well, hello everyone, and welcome to this very exciting session, Civilizations in Review, chatting all about the Qatna Empire, kingdom, dynasty that we'll chat about really soon. Just welcome all for those tuning in on Facebook. Glad you're here. We also will be sharing this to our Instagram, our YouTube, our Spotify, and our website, so you can engage with all the phenomenal content that we'll dive in today. It's a really, really interesting empire. And again, I'm just so grateful to Randy Al-Ghawi, our content writer, for focusing on it, and Grace, who's calling in from Lebanon, who wrote Syria 101, relevant to Qatna Kingdom, to chat even more. So welcome all. It's a very interesting ancient kingdom we're going to jump into today, and I will throw it to Grace to start us off and read the 101 word introduction. Take it away.
Of course. Thank you, Ben, and thank you, Randy, for this awesome content about Qatna. To start us off, the ancient kingdom of Qatna, or Tel al-Mishrafiyya, is located in modern-day Western Syria near Homs, an Amorite kingdom governed between the early Bronze 3rd to 4th, which is around 2600 to 2000 BCE. And throughout 14 and 15 BCE, the Aramaeans inhabited the kingdom of Qatna, while several different rulers occupied the region during that era. So Qatna was under the rule of the Egyptians, the Hittites, and the Mitanni influence. And before then, the Amorites autonomously governed the region. The kingdom's reign was consistent through 2600 to 1300 BCE until being abandoned in the 10th century. Sources are obscure, which leaves the historical context of the kingdom of Qatna forgotten.
What an intro. I always like to begin all these conversations with the same question, so we'll do the same today, Randy. What prompted you to choose the Qatna kingdom?
Yeah, well, honestly, my interest did fall on regional interest just because it's very close to home. And actually, Tel al-Mishrif is close to, actually, it governed Lebanon at one point. It bordered Lebanon, mostly in Syria. So my interest stemmed from there. And upon researching it, and Grace was mentioning it earlier, but outside of Syria, not many people know that it exists. And if they do know it exists, it's very obscure history. There's not a lot of content on it. And I think that because of that, it makes it so much more appealing to the reader. It's kind of like a legendary myth, like, oh, this civilization exists. What about it? It's very interesting to learn more about it and to see the history behind, I would say, a forgotten kingdom in a sense.
Yeah, fascinating. Thank you for adding to our knowledge on it. The entire reason we have the Civilizations in Review section is to educate global communities about these different empires, kingdoms, dynasties, caliphates, etc. So thank you for taking on Qatna, and that's great that you have some personal connection to it too. Grace, if you have a question from all the great resource here, I'll throw it to you next.
Yeah, Randy, I just, if you could talk about some of the archaeological evidence. I know that one of the great accomplishments of this empire is that great palace that was built in sort of the remains. If you could talk a little bit about that, over 80 rooms. I'm just interested to hear more about specifically, this palace and maybe what was found in there, those kind of artifacts that are evidence for this forgotten kingdom that is not forgotten, but maybe not as well known.
Yeah, interesting enough, the excavation sites, when I was looking up evidence, mainly spoke about the royal palace because, as you noted, there's 80 rooms on just one level. And what's interesting, that's kind of like an MTV crib tour. Like in just one level, 80 rooms. So even when it got destroyed, there's a lot of evidence about the kingdom that a lot of people were able to dig up. Mostly it was a lot of sculptures, religious sculptures, had multiple gods and multiple figurines. And it's interesting because most of the data didn't come from any of the Qatna sources because the scriptures were from other empires that lasted, or their evidence lasted longer. But that palace was just so big that it could not be destroyed completely. And that was one of their biggest feat, because if you really think about it, that palace alone, even though aesthetically they're probably doing it because the royalty and whatnot, it left a mark in history. Without that palace, there would have been lack of evidence. There wouldn't have been a lot of people digging up evidence. people even knowing that, okay, what was this for? Was it linked to? And even today, I mean, unfortunately, during the Syrian civil war, they stopped the excavation sites. That's the last I saw. I don't know if they continued now more recently, but there are probably a lot of more evidence there that they could dig up in the future and tell us more about it. But as of now, the royal palace is something that I think preserved a lot of history of Qatna. It's very interesting that they used it as an excavation site and were able to dig up some information.
That is incredibly fascinating. And the main image of Qatna is some of the excavations from that royal palace. It's like a portal, what's the thingy where you grind it, food and stuff? Pestle and mortar. That's the
Mortar and
Pestle and
pestle.
mortar,
Yeah.
I was mixing all of them into one mega word. Thank you. That is the main image of Qatna that was found at this palace. I'm not gonna say it again because I've already forgotten the proper way of using the words, but check it out, check that image. It was excavated at this place. And I think, I mean, especially these, 3000 BCE and earlier empires, this is really the best way we know about them is the legacy of things they left behind. So, I mean, I know this is a similar question to Grace, but like, just tell us more about what they have excavated, how have they connected to the Qatna kingdom at large, just all your information in relation to this archaeology.
You said it was more connected question to.
Well, I mean, just tell us even more about the excavation process, the archaeological findings. I think, especially for the super old and ancient empires here, this is the coolest and only way we really know about some of these places. And so I want you to speak more to it.
So in fact, one of the cool things about Qatna is it was on a hill, and that's what tel means. It's a hill. So in fact, even when the remnants of the royal palace collapsed, that hill kind of preserved a lot of the history. And interestingly enough, the land was very fertile. And because of that, we learned through more from, not from the excavation sites, but more from texts of different empires, that it was a very sought out ally because of just how much of resources it has. It literally was in the Palmyra oasis. So while other empires had drought, it was able to sustain a lot of crops and trade with other empires. And there was some evidence from the excavation of letters. I know that they had a letter of one of the kings of Qatna, and he was able to, his name was Samshi Ada, he was able to communicate with Mari, a political ally, and they showed like the connection about what they were sending. Like he was sending one of the king's horses and trading, and it was just interesting just to see the dynamic between the two kings and how everything was set up. And then there was also evidence of when Samsi Ada passed away and his son took over. That's kind of the decline of the kingdom, because the son's political alliance with Mari was suffered from that, because his dad had a very good relationship with the king of Mari, but then when the son came, and it kind of was scrambled, everything fell apart from there. And that reliance and alliance kept different people from attacking it, and that was the downfall. But yeah, the excavation site, I would say the process was very simple. I mean, a lot of the excavation sites I was looking up and the text were in Arabic, because a lot of Syrians, to preserve their history, and they're just very proud of their land and the history it holds, were going to such sites and gathering a lot of information, especially on something that they knew that this was attacked and destroyed, this kingdom. So they're like, there has to be information here. There has to be sites where we can dig up and preserve some history. And that's where it started, I think, in preserving the history. In fact, one of the research papers was published from Damascus University. So they send an excavation team specifically to do research and publish it for the university to preserve that history. So I think that's where it came from, mostly preserving the history on the excavation site.
Fascinating. Thank you for sharing more. I think the super old ancient kingdoms that we have at Al Fusaic as you have so eloquently stated, survived because of those who have excavated it. So
Yeah.
to help, educate and share what this influential kingdom did for, gosh, the 600 years it existed, BCE, was really influential. So thank you for sharing. Grace, anything else that popped up and interesting to you when you read through it all?
Yeah, and actually, just from something you said, Randy, and I know that you have limited space in the Civilizations 101 article. There's so much information, like you said, that has been performed on the excavation site, and especially in Syria, about this area. You mentioned that there were figures to multiple gods. Can you talk a little bit about the religion practiced during this kingdom when it in its highest points, or really
Yeah.
just before it fell? I'm just really interested to hear.
Of course, yeah. So because there was limited information on the gods they worshipped, one thing they did acknowledge based on the research was a lot of the influence came from Mesopotamian gods and influence. So they had a very tight connection with culturally speaking and religiously speaking with different kingdoms within the region. Them themselves didn't establish their own religion. In fact, that was kind of in the research one of the weaker things I found, like something that culturally they did, or something that stood out to their kingdom different than others, because it was very similar to the surrounding area. So there wasn't really anything significant in that department. So yeah, religiously speaking, I would say their influence came from Mesopotamian gods, and there's just many gods. So that was one thing that I just saw a figurine. One of the excavations had a figurine of it looked like a female goddess, and it looked like a female goddess of life. But other than that, there's not much I could speak about that because I found limited evidence in that department.
Fascinating. I like hearing the what does a day-to-day life look like in these ancient empires, and the best that you could find out, given that it was, gosh, 4,000 years ago. So that's helpful. Thank you. I'm really interested, as you sort of mentioned, the strategic trading piece of the Qatna kingdom, and the several allies and potentially rivals that this kingdom have. Can you talk a little bit more about the other kingdoms and empires that surrounded the Qatna community?
Yeah, the Assyrian Empire was one of the biggest one, and obviously this one was interesting too. But the Egyptian kingdom also had influence in Qatna, because over the course of years, many of these kingdoms occupied it at one point. And although it wasn't like subjugating them, it was like, okay, we're in power now. You do things through us, and it was kind of like they had their influence, but then they knew who's in charge. So the Assyrian Empire and the connection to Mara was actually their downfall, because when they lost power, the Hittites found an opportunity to attack, and because they're very jealous, and in fact, that this was interesting, they're actually just very envious of Qatna. They end up sacking it, and it was sacked and destroyed initially in 1340 BCE, but then it wasn't abandoned until 720 BCE, because the remnants of Qatna stayed, but most people had really there's no more kingdom then. So it was just kind of sad to see really something that once had political influence, and out of the other kingdoms, it was an area where even though kingdoms couldn't produce any crops, they relied on Qatna for that. And when it was destroyed, instead of being taken, as its own city, it was destroyed completely, even though it was a strategic position and other kingdoms could have benefited from taking over. So yeah, mostly the trade, I would say, came from their ability to grow in an area where was had drought and susceptible to not being able to grow crops year round. And with that being said, once they established their relationship, it was a very essential point in their history to stay relevant for so many years, really, compared to other kingdoms that were sacked and destroyed. They're able to be in the middle of literally multiple large kingdoms and stay and sustain themselves for a long time, just because of their political alliances to different kingdoms. And Assyria was a big one That was the one that they were able to trade with and negotiate with. In fact, at one point, the Assyrian king and the king of Qatna were cousins. They're both Samshi Ada and Ishki Ada, and they're both cousins. So it was interesting. They had like a familial tie too, not just a political tie.
Really interesting. It seems like, almost the strongest points of this kingdom also ended up kind of being the reasons for its downfall. Like you said, the surrounding kingdoms envied its power. And then really interesting about how the land, so fertile and good for growing. And it was sacked and destroyed rather than just used for a new kingdom. I know you mentioned previously about the king writing letters, to a different dynasty, and there's some evidence about this civilization through that. Are there any other facts or interesting stories you can share, maybe about some of the ruling families, through the 600 years that this kingdom existed?
Yeah, I mean, evidence was lacking there, but one thing I did mention is this: once Ishki Ada passed away and his son ruled, one letter showed kind of the shift in alliance, because he sent a letter to one of the Assyrian kings, and it was the research noted that it was disrespectful. Like, it was a tone that was scornful, in a sense that kind of just obliterated anything that they had in terms of relation. And it wasn't like disrespectful in a sense that was like, oh man, like he just used some vile language. It was just kind of like he was a young man, so it's kind of like this young man is sending a letter to a king. He just doesn't know how to rule necessarily, because he still has a mindset of a young man. And it was just interesting to read that, because I thought that part of history, you can kind of compare it to day-to-day life, because sometimes people say, like, when they have kids, oh, my teenager is giving me a lot of trouble. So that's what I pictured it as he's transitioning to become a king. He went from just being a regular son of a king, just doing whatever he does on a daily basis, to ruling a whole kingdom. So how from going from day one to the next like that, there's a lot of burden on your shoulder, but also you're still a kid at the end of the day, I would say.
That's interesting that they could tell in ancient language the like tone that it was rude. That's so fascinating.
Yeah.
Do you know more about that specific letter and exchange? I'm so interested in how they deciphered not only what it meant, but that it also was like a pompous kid, right? I don't know, that's so interesting to me.
I don't know more about the letter, only from that point, because actually my aunt and I were discussing it, and we thought it was kind of funny, in a sense that you could see that they had a strong relationship, and I said a familial tie, and then it just evaporated just from that, and that letter kind of shows the downfall. Other than that, there's lack of evidence on that end, because the archives of Qatna were destroyed, but also like Mari was also sacked. I'm not sure if destroyed, but it was sacked. In Assyria, I'm not sure about that too, but there is lack of evidence. So some of the texts that were archived, they're fortunate enough to get some related to Qatna.
That's so fascinating. My goodness, I just thank you for compiling all of these sources and making this digestible. I know there's maybe much more you could have written. Maybe this was the exact word limit, given how much little there is out there. I'm curious about the al-Mishrafiyya piece of it. I mean, I know Tal means hill, but yeah, it's called Qatna or Tal al-Mishrafiyya. Do you know more about the second name?
So I did ask my father, just because I wanted to see what al-Mishrafiyya means, and he told me, and I'm not sure how accurate this is. He says it's an overlook. So he's translating from Arabic, but I'm not entirely sure. But when he told me that Tel is like the hill, so right, it's like an overlooking hill, which I would make sense, but I'm just not entirely sure, because I tried myself looking it up, and I was not very fortunate. So I may leave that to someone else to kind of decipher it, but that's what he told me. And I thought it was interesting, just because the whole thing with naming cities over Tel is very, very, you see, like in Arabic culture, like It's very prevalent. And every, like, for example, I'm from an area called Shuaifit, which comes from a word in Fasha, which means hill. So Shuaifit means many hills. And so Tel is another word for hill. So it just shows you the significance of using the hill. So that, and yeah, that's something that I kind of have to do more research on. I couldn't find the meaning.
Interesting. Yeah, that's pretty cool. Any other final pieces, Grace, as we wrap up that you want to ask Randy about?
Yeah, I mean, I just have before, maybe the last piece of information that you really want to the audience to stay with before that question. I wanted to ask, because we talked about how it's been forgotten, maybe a lot of the modern or influence on modern society can't be seen, but what influence do you think that this empire had on maybe the ones that came right after it, because it was sacked rather than sacked and destroyed rather than just taken immediately into a new kingdom? Maybe just influence that it had in particular on the empires or kingdoms surrounding. What do you think that this one brought specifically or especially?
What I believe it brought, even before it became a kingdom, was the group of individuals that left Mesopotamia, a bigger kingdom, to make a smaller kingdom and have it grow. I think it was a sign to whoever, that's why they abandoned it, whoever was trying to form a kingdom or a civilization, to kind of know that they could still survive and try to find different ways and means to survive. And I feel like Qatna is the perfect example of it, because once it got destroyed and sacked, they didn't stay to revive it. They abandoned it because their mindset was probably like, we've done this once, we can do it again. And I feel like the growth of influence came from that mindset to survive. Another thing is, I believe that if they played their tools right, I mean, I didn't track them after the fall of the kingdom. They played their tools right and they're able to grow and have connections politically speaking. I think they would be able to replicate that, or at least advise some ruling classes and kingdoms and how to form these political alliances and how to grow and trade. That's one thing that I got out of it personally.
Incredible. Yeah, I could see I mean, every single empire you have just mentioned is also in our Civilizations in Review section. And so you can sort of track this history of the Qatna was around all these other empires, and then the ones that came immediately after, also in Syria, probably was a legacy of the Qatna. So that's cool. Thank you for sharing that. My last question is, again, there is so much more here. Please go to the website, check it out, Civilizations in Review, in the alfuzaic.net, our website. I'm super interested. Again, I know it's really hard because not only were the excavation sites all closed in 2011 and this empire was 4,000 years ago, but if there's sort of any other modern day components that you maybe can see today. I mean, this maybe is a stretch, but I'm going to ask it no matter what, if you know of any.
I personally was not able to find anything, and because it was destroyed and abandoned, it was hard to find something. But one thing I did learn is that a lot of Syrian archives in Arabic have preserved its history. I mean, the influence, I think, from a historical point of view, especially to a Syrian nationalist, is they're proud of that history. So it's not forgotten domestically. And I think that was one giveaway I took. Although it doesn't have a structure, it doesn't have like something physically there, besides excavation sites that have historical components on that regard, different artifacts. But historically speaking, I believe that it left a mark for Syria. And Syria is rich with history and culture. So it's no surprise that there's in Syrian archives, there's a lot of information on Qatna. That's as far as what I saw. I mean, I personally was really not able to find a modern influence. And it was because it was a smaller kingdom compared to the larger kingdoms surrounding it. So it was kind of overshadowed in that regard, on top of the fact of being completely destroyed and abandoned. So
what a beautiful sentiment to end on, that the Syrian archives have dedicated and preserved it incredibly well. And that's something to cherish and hold on to. that's, I think, where we're going to end. I think that's a nice stopping point. Again, thank you so much, Randy, for compiling all this information, doing some translation work. These smaller, less well-known, kingdoms and dynasties are a little bit harder to compile and to have showcases so beautifully and share this knowledge information. I mean, I think you're now one of the top global Qatna experts, so welcome. If you want to give yourself that title or not, I will give it to you. But regardless, grateful that you have compiled it. Thank you, Grace, for your connections. Again, you wrote Syria 101, so parts of Syria 101 were very much influenced in some way by Qatna, and so I love to see that connection over history and time. And thank you all to our listeners for engaging with this, watching, listening, hopefully reading and deepening your knowledge on the Qatna and all the other incredible empires we have in our section. That's it for us. Have a wonderful evening. Go check us out at alfusaic.net. That's ALFUSAIC.net. Have a good evening. Thanks again.